So I have this idea, and I've had this idea for a while, and the idea is that leadership might be something other than, or even something more than, they say it is in those books you buy in the airport. And I've been thinking this for a while, and the thought has driven a fair bit of research on my part. And I can go back a number of years to when I first started thinking this, and it was actually a moment that I remember quite well. I was walking around a lake. I lived close to a lake at the time, and at one end of this lake there was this big field where people would take their dogs, and the dogs would go off the leash and play. And I noticed that in this one particular group of dogs that was chasing a ball, that one of the dogs seemed to be the leader, which I thought was odd. The other dogs were deferring to it. They would let this one dog catch the ball even if the other dogs were running faster. And I thought, isn't it interesting how the one dog seemed to assume the mantle of leadership so easily, even when leadership seemed to be so complicated and so complex. I'd been studying leadership even then. I'd been studying it for a couple of years, and I thought, that seems too easy. Because the literature was telling me that leadership was much more difficult than that. So I thought maybe what I was looking at with the dogs wasn't leadership at all. I thought maybe what I was looking at with the dogs was just dominance. So I thought, well, if that's just dominance, and yet it looked so much like leadership, I thought maybe much of what we see as leadership in our world is just dominance. And like I said, that drove me down a path of research that took many years. And so I want to talk a little bit about that research. I want to go back in history. In fact, I want to take a journey through history looking at our attitudes towards leadership. So if we start 10,000 years ago, maybe even more, 10,000 plus years ago, what we see is, in different places in the world, the beginning of meaningful community, the beginning of what we think of as civilization. A historian named Daniel Smale talks about this period of history. He calls it deep history because there are no records, but he's making some assumptions. And what he said was, sometime back around then, our ancestors came in out of the jungle, or they came in off the savannah, or they came down out of the trees, and they came together to create civilization, or they came together in meaningful community. And it wasn't until then that they became truly human. So it was this coming together in community that gave rise to our humanity. It's not the other way around, and that's significant, I think. It wasn't that humans created human communities, it was that communities created our humanness. So it was this focus on collaboration, a focus on collective action that defined our humanness. And it was when we let go of our selfish individualism that we became truly human. We'll come back to that. Later on in history, maybe about 2,500 years ago, as far as I know, that's when the first book basically on leadership was written. And the book was called the Tao Te Ching. It was written by a fellow named Lao Tzu in China. And Lao Tzu wrote about the importance of virtue, following a path of virtue. So the leader, and he spoke quite a bit about leadership in this book, the leader is trying to improve the lives and improve the situation of those who follow. So once again, we're seeing this focus on community. Also, significantly, Lao Tzu talked about feminine approaches to leadership, as opposed to the dominant masculine approach. Lao Tzu was talking about a feminine approach to leadership, a more networked, gentler approach to leadership. A couple of hundred years later, in history, in a different part of the world, Plato wrote the Republic. Now, Plato's perspective was a little bit different. He still talked about virtue, although he used the word justice, but his focus became a little bit more clearly on the leader. So you probably remember from your Philosophy 101 class, the cave, the metaphor of the cave, and so he was suggesting that most of us are like we're in a cave and chained to the wall and only able to look at the back wall of the cave, and what happens is we can only see shadows of reality because the reality is coming in behind us. We can't look out of the cave. We can only see the shadows of the wall, the shadows on the wall of reality. And what we need to do is we need to raise a great man, a philosopher king, up out of the cave to experience reality and come back down to lead us. So now we're seeing the beginning of the great man theory of leadership. So we're seeing a slight shift away from what Lao Tzu was talking about. Hundreds of years later, in the early 16th century, a gentleman named Niccolo Machiavelli, as you'll recall, wrote a book called The Prince. And in The Prince, he shifts the nature of leadership entirely. It's not him that did this. He was simply writing about a process that had been going on for many years. But he shifted the focus of leadership entirely when he said that the followers are there to accomplish the leader's goals, as opposed to the leader being there to improve the situation of followers. It was the other way around. And we're seeing more of a return to selfish individualism because the leader is getting their goals met through the actions of the followers. That's a little bit more like what I saw by the lake that day when the one dog was dominating the other dogs. I think we still have that Machiavellian view of leadership, even though we're approaching leadership with a kinder, gentler hand. I think we're still looking at having the leader's goals accomplished through the actions of the followers. A few hundred years later, we're almost there. A few hundred years later, we see a guy named Thomas Carlyle, a dour old Scotsman. And Thomas Carlyle actually coined the term the great man theory of leadership. And Thomas Carlyle said that every event throughout history can be attributed to just one or a few great men that were involved in that event. Now the criticism of the great man theory, the criticism is that it doesn't take into account other systemic factors that were occurring at the same time. So we can't simply attribute every action throughout history or every event throughout history to a great man, practicing what we call dyadic influence. So the great man is influencing someone else to do what the great man thinks is important. Now we're really seeing this focus on dominance, just as the dogs did. We're seeing people do it now, only people are now calling it leadership. Now, if we come forward into our current reality, what we see is that many of the authors are writing about dyadic influence and calling it leadership. They're saying that what the leader needs to do to accomplish a certain goal is behave in this way so that the followers will accomplish the leader's goals. And that seems to me that it's possible, that it might be a return to the selfish individualism that we had 10,000 years ago. Also, if you look at the literature today, one of the things that the literature focuses on is systems thinking. And systems thinking tells us very clearly that you can't understand a system, a human system. You can't understand it by looking at just one or two or three of the agents of the system. Rather, you have to look at all of the agents of the system and how they're interreacting and interrelating. So, even some of these systems thinkers make the mistake then of going back and saying, so what the leader needs to do, what the leader needs to understand is, and I think to myself, wait a minute, you just said that we can't understand the system by focusing on just one aspect of the system or just one agent of the system. You said we have to look at the whole system. And if we do that and we really allow ourselves to take systems thinking seriously, what we see is that in order to understand leadership, we need to look at everyone in the system, not just one person. And it takes a bit of a focus off the leader and puts it rather on the collective, which takes us back to what Daniel Smale was talking about when he said humanity is about how we are together. And it takes us away from what the dogs were doing by the lake and takes our focus off of dyadic influence and puts it onto the system. And I believe that that's what that's what leadership is. I'm not saying I have the one right answer. I'm not saying that that everybody else is writing about leadership is incorrect. I'm not saying that I have the one true way forward. What I am saying is that I think that it's worthwhile thinking about this. That if we look at leadership as something that towards which everyone in the system contributes, but not anything that anyone does, I think we might increase our abilities. I think we might enhance our experience, and I think we might achieve greater results simply through collaborating rather than dominating. That's my TED Talk. I don't know where Ted is. I don't even know who Ted is. I'm done.